If you like our short stories, please like, comment, and subscribe. Jonas Gray pulled his wool collar tight against the icy wind that whistled through the towering pines. A bitter chill clung to the mountain air, far colder than any winter he'd endured since moving to Silvervale. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this December, something in the way the snow fell, almost too perfect, too still. Then, earlier that morning, he noticed for the first time what he later called the red frost. From the window of the tiny woodcraft shop he owned, Jonas had spotted the peculiar shimmer spreading across the windowsill. At first glance, it looked like a normal patch of frost except for a faint blush, as though someone had streaked red dye along the edges of each spiky crystal. His breath caught. He placed a hand on the glass, and cold radiated through his glove so sharply that it burned. Whatever this frost was, it felt alive. Silvervale had seemed like the perfect place to start over when he lost his wife, Emily, a few years ago. He'd needed somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the busyness of city streets and constant reminders of his old life. His 8-year-old daughter, Olivia, was equally enthralled by the quaint mountain town. Cozy cabins, majestic evergreens, and gentle snowfall that started in November and lasted all the way through Christmas. But this December hadn't felt gentle at all. Peeking behind him, Jonas saw Olivia engrossed in her coloring book by the stove. She wore 2 sweaters, a little hat, and gloves with the fingertips cut off so she could still hold her crayons. The old wood-burning stove rattled and coughed as it fought to keep the shop warm. Fuel had been dwindling in Silvervale, courtesy of the unrelenting weather. Day after day, storm clouds strangled the sun, leaving the town in a perpetual gloom. "You okay, kiddo?" Jonas asked softly, trying to keep the quiver out of his voice. Olivia looked up, her big brown eyes shining with a childlike trust. "I'm good, Dad," she said. "Just wish it would snow normal again. It's too cold to go out and build a snowman." Jonas forced a smile. "Maybe soon," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The bell above the shop door jangled, cutting through the silence. Mayor Caldwell stepped in, his tall frame dwarfed by layers of thick winter gear. His face was set in a grim expression, and for a moment he said nothing, simply rubbing his gloved hands. Jonas recognized the mayor's mood. Bad news had a way of traveling quickly in a small town. "Jonas," Mayor Caldwell said in a low tone. "We need your help. We're organizing a search team." Jonas frowned. "What happened?" Caldwell let out a long breath, forming a plume of steam in the frigid air. "2 of our residents have gone missing. Their families say they disappeared overnight." A chill unrelated to the temperature slid through Jonas's bones. "Any sign of foul play?" The mayor shook his head. "No signs of anything. Just footprints ending in a patch of some sort of red ice. After that, nothing. It's like they vanished." Jonas exchanged a glance with Olivia, who looked worried now. "I'll join you," he said. "Just let me lock up. Where do we start?" Within the hour, Jonas found himself trekking through knee-deep snow with a handful of volunteers, weaving between evergreens that whispered ominously in the wind. The red frost seemed to cling to every surface: tree trunks, rocks, the edges of old wooden fences. Beneath each volunteer's boots it crackled and splintered with an almost metallic resonance. Though Jonas had grown up in snowy winters, he'd never felt snow so deathly cold that it stung like static electricity. Dr. Rivera, a traveling scientist stranded in Silvervale by the storms, joined the search. She had insisted on coming, explaining she might recognize any atypical phenomena. Jonas was grateful for her expertise, though he doubted she'd ever studied something like this under normal circumstances. While the search team spread out, Jonas and Dr. Rivera moved along an old logging trail behind the cabins on the outskirts of town. When Jonas knelt to brush powdery snow aside, he spotted clear, sharp footprints leading out of one of the missing residents' backyards. Then the footprints just stopped. Dr. Rivera crouched next to him. "Remarkable," she whispered. Her breath shook with adrenaline and fear. "Look at this." She chipped away a piece of the frost, revealing deep red crystals that glittered like garnets. A sharp hiss escaped, as if the frost itself took offense at being disturbed. "How is it so red?" Jonas asked, unable to hide his unease. "I'm not sure, but I can feel it pulling heat from my glove, almost like it's feeding." She swallowed hard. "I've never seen anything like this." Jonas felt an instinctive dread coil in his stomach. "If it's feeding on heat, does that mean it's alive?" Dr. Rivera didn't answer. She kept carefully slipping the sample into a small vial, her expression grim. Then, as if nature wanted to confirm their fears, a cold wind howled through the trees, and Jonas swore he heard a faint whisper woven into the gusts. It sounded like someone calling his name. He jerked around, heart pounding. Nothing was there, just red-tinted skeletal branches swaying in the wind. They continued searching until dusk, but no luck. It was as though the missing neighbors had vanished into thin air, stolen away by the silent, pulsing frost. Despite the cold seeping into his bones, Jonas's main concern was Olivia. He needed to get back to her. The sun would set soon, and he didn't want his daughter alone in an unheated shop during this unsettling phenomenon. When Jonas returned to the shop, Olivia was sleeping near the stove. He stoked the fire and carefully draped a blanket over her small body. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he couldn't shake the dread that had settled in his mind. Something was very wrong with Silvervale this Christmas, and he had a feeling the red frost was only getting started. Jonas reached out to touch the shop window, hoping to brush away the crimson streaks. The glass was so cold that he recoiled in pain. In the weak glow of the lantern, the frost seemed to shift under his gaze, as if aware of his presence. He saw the reflection of his own wide, frightened eyes, and behind him, Olivia's slumbering form. A rush of protectiveness surged through him. He'd do anything to keep her safe. Then he noticed the radio on the counter flicker with static. Briefly, he heard Mayor Caldwell's voice. All units, multiple sightings, red frost spreading, maintain indoors at night, vanishings, use caution. The signal cut in and out before going silent. Jonas's dread deepened. They weren't just dealing with bad weather. This was a menace, claiming victims under cover of darkness. He locked the door and checked the fire once more before settling beside Olivia. As the last traces of twilight faded outside, an uncanny silence filled the world. Jonas realized with a shiver that even the wind had died, as if the winter night held its breath in anticipation. In that hush, the red frost covering the window began to faintly glow. Jonas closed his eyes, clinging to Olivia's warmth and the soft crackle of burning wood. He prayed for morning to come quickly, desperate for answers and safety. Yet even in his drifting thoughts, he felt an unsettling certainty. The frost would come for them all if they didn't stop it. Morning arrived without any fanfare. The sun, pale and distant behind ashen clouds, offered no warmth to the beleaguered town of Silvervale. Jonas woke to a dull ache in his joints and found Olivia curled against him, still asleep by the stove. It took him a moment to remember why he was sleeping on the floor of his own shop. Then he spotted the red frost on the windows, jagged and menacing in the gray light. Memory returned like a cold slap to the face. He sat up and carefully shook Olivia awake. They both shared a simple breakfast of stale bread and lukewarm water. Supplies were running dangerously low all over town. The local grocery had been picked clean in anticipation of the storms, and deliveries wouldn't arrive until the mountain roads cleared. Silvervale felt more isolated than ever. "I'm going to head over to town hall," Jonas said, rubbing the dark circles under his eyes. "Stay here and keep the fire going, okay?" Olivia gave him a reluctant nod. Despite her youth, she was old enough to sense something big and frightening was happening. "Be careful, Dad," she whispered. Town hall was only a few blocks away, but walking felt like trudging across a frozen tundra. The red frost glistened on fences, rooftops, and pine needles. Occasionally, Jonas noticed bright red crystals jutting out like dagger-sharp spikes on car hoods. It was as though the frost was growing bolder, claiming anything warm enough to sustain it. When he reached the old brick building, he saw a group of anxious townspeople gathered in the foyer, trying to warm themselves near a single propane heater. Mayor Caldwell stood at a lectern, flipping through notes while Dr. Rivera addressed the crowd. "The sample I collected shows an alarming heat absorption rate," she explained, holding up a small glass vial filled with red ice crystals that sparkled like broken rubies. "It's pulling thermal energy from everything around it, living or not. The more heat it gathers, the faster it spreads." A somber murmur filled the room. One elderly man coughed violently in the cold air, his breath escaping in short bursts of vapor. Jonas frowned, feeling a pang of fear twist in his chest. If the frost was alive and feeding, then how could they possibly stop it? Mayor Caldwell motioned Jonas over. "We're updating everyone on the situation," he said, his voice low. "We've had 3 more disappearances overnight." Jonas's eyes widened. 3 more? Who?" "Kara Bishop, Dave Fielder, and young Tommy Granger. His mother's beside herself." The mayor shook his head. frustration evident in every tense line of his face. They were at home, locked doors and all. In the morning, gone. Just a trail of footprints leading outside to a big patch of that damned frost. Jonas pictured Olivia alone at his shop and swallowed hard, resisting the urge to sprint back. "This can't keep happening," he said. "We have to do something." Dr. Rivera cleared her throat, sensing the conversation. "I've been running calculations. We need to limit exposure to the cold as much as possible. That means rationing heat sources and consolidating people in fewer buildings. Strength in numbers. If we all band together in, say, town hall or the church, we can try to maintain a higher temperature." "Won't that just make a bigger target for the frost?" Jonas asked, voicing the thought that gnawed at him. "Potentially," Dr. Rivera admitted. "But separated, we're vulnerable. We need to think of immediate survival while we search for a permanent solution." Mayor Caldwell motioned for everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, for now, we'll have to stay together at Town Hall. Bring your families, essential supplies, and anything we can burn for warmth. Lock up your houses, but don't linger. We'll form teams to help those who need assistance." The plan was met with a hesitant, murmuring agreement. Everyone knew it was risky, but so was staying put in smaller, scattered homes that might as well have been targets for the mysterious frost. Jonas stepped aside, quickly calling his shop's landline to check on Olivia. No answer. He tried again, still no answer. Anxiety gnawed at his stomach. The line must have been down. He'd have to hurry back and get her. He sprinted through the brittle air, ignoring the way his lungs burned with each ragged breath. The sky hung heavy with the promise of another snowstorm, and Jonas sensed the temperature dropping even further. Had it always been so cold, or was the frost somehow sapping what little warmth remained in the atmosphere? When Jonas burst into the shop, he found Olivia still by the stove. Relief flooded him. She looked up, startled by his abrupt entrance. "Dad?" she asked, voice trembling. "The phone rang and then cut off. I got scared." "It's okay, we're both okay," Jonas said, swallowing the panic in his throat. "Listen, we have to move. We're gathering at Town Hall. It's safer there, or at least that's the plan. Pack whatever you can quickly. We won't be back here for a while." Olivia nodded, hurriedly stuffing her small backpack with a change of clothes, a cherished stuffed animal, and some of her crayons. Jonas grabbed extra blankets, cans of food, and a few personal items, photographs of Emily mostly. He couldn't leave those behind. Outside, the wind had started again, swirling around them in icy gusts. Patches of the red frost glittered ominously in the daylight, each crystal reflecting the grim, pale sky. They managed to reach Town Hall with minimal trouble, though Olivia gasped when her foot grazed a crimson-coated curb. Feeling the frost instantly leach warmth from her boot, she pulled away, shivering, and kept close to her father. By midday, more townspeople arrived at Town Hall in a staggered stream, each group bringing whatever supplies they had: canned goods, flashlights, propane tanks, old quilts, even battered wooden furniture to burn if necessary. Dr. Rivera coordinated a makeshift lab in one corner, placing her red ice samples on a metal tray and noting every minor change. The scene resembled a wartime shelter: frightened faces, huddled families, the smell of desperation. Still, Jonas's heart lifted a bit seeing neighbors helping one another. In times of crisis, Silvervale was the kind of town that pulled together. He just hoped it would be enough. Around nightfall, the sense of foreboding returned tenfold. Jonas sat next to Olivia and listened to the howling wind outside. The building was mostly dark. They had limited fuel for the generator, so lights were used sparingly. Mayor Caldwell lit a lantern, illuminating the anxious faces gathered in the main hall. A hush fell over everyone as if waiting for an announcement, or perhaps for something terrible to happen. Suddenly, the wind died in an instant, an eerie silence that left ears ringing. Jonas felt a drop in temperature so profound it nearly stole his breath. The windows of Town Hall glazed over with a fresh layer of the red frost, crackling across the glass like branching veins. Dr. Rivera jumped to her feet, muttering hurried observations into her notepad. Others clung to each other, terrified. That's when the scratching started. Faint at first, barely audible. Then a chorus of sharp scraping noises on every window and door, as if dozens of nails raked the exterior. Olivia clutched Jonas's arm, her eyes wide with dread. A wave of panic rippled through the gathered crowd. Jonas's heart pounded as he stood, scanning the windows. He caught a glimpse of something moving against the crimson frost, an elongated shape that seemed half fused with the ice itself. a figure, or maybe multiple figures, writhing just beyond the glass. It was impossible to see any detail, but Jonas sensed they were looking in, searching for warmth, for life. His skin crawled. At that moment, a deafening crack echoed from the roof, followed by the distant, chilling sound of glass shattering somewhere down the hallway. Silvervale's fragile refuge was under siege by a horror they scarcely understood. Jonas held Olivia close, determination flaring in his chest. They would survive this. He had to believe that. And yet, as a collective scream rang out from behind the town hall offices, Jonas couldn't help but feel this was only the beginning of the Red Frost's true power, its unstoppable hunger for human warmth and life itself. Glass shards tinkled across the linoleum floor of the town hall corridor, each chime echoing like the last notes of a sinister lullaby. Jonas's mind raced as the crowd pressed inward, panic suffocating the main hall. Olivia clung to his arm, trembling. It was like being trapped inside a giant snow globe, except the swirling flakes outside were a lethal crimson frost. A terrified scream erupted nearby. Several townspeople sprinted toward the source of the noise, a shattered window in a side room where the red frost had forced its way in. Jonas could just make out that same writhing shape near the broken pane, half-living ice with elongated limbs that seemed to melt and reform at will. The shards of frost, crimson, crystalline, spilled onto the floor, radiating cold so intense it burned. A jolt of horror cut through Jonas. The frost wasn't just passively absorbing heat, it was actively hunting. "Everyone back!" Dr. Rivera shouted. She snatched a fire extinguisher from the wall, aiming a spray of carbon dioxide at the swirling red mass. A crackling hiss split the air, and the frost shrank back momentarily, leaving behind a smear of translucent red that continued to pulse with an alien glow. "That did something," Jonas muttered, eyeing the frost's reaction. "At least it slowed it down." Dr. Rivera nodded, breath ragged. "Carbon dioxide is extremely cold when discharged. It's possible it disrupted the frost's structure, but it'll only last for so long." Mayor Caldwell, pale-faced, took stock of the chaotic scene. "Dr. Rivera, do you have any other tools we can use?" She lifted a trembling hand to her forehead. "I've been analyzing the sample. The crystals absorb thermal energy at an incredible rate, almost like a reverse catalyst that keeps feeding on itself. If we manage to break that chain reaction, even briefly, we might stop it. But we'd need something powerful." A hush settled over the hall, broken only by the whimpering of frightened children and the distant scratching of more frost limbs against the walls. Jonas looked down at Olivia, recalling how the flames in his wood stove kept the frost at bay for a little while. Fire was warmth, though, and that was exactly what the frost craved. It was a risk, but maybe Dr. Rivera had a plan. "Mayor, Dr. Rivera," Jonas said. "Is there any place in Silvervale with a big enough heat source? Something we could use to lure the frost away from everyone else?" Caldwell frowned. "There's the old factory's boiler system on the north side of town, but it hasn't run in years." Dr. Rivera's eyes lit with sudden inspiration. "If we could get it working, if we feed the frost too much heat all at once, maybe we can force a meltdown in its structure. The same principle as short-circuiting a circuit board with an overload." It was an insane idea, but desperation fueled them. Jonas scanned the hall, noticing more swirling shapes pressing against the tinted windows, red crystals spiderwebbing across the glass. They had to do something before everyone froze to death or vanished into those horrifying patches of crimson. "All right," Jonas said, taking a steadying breath. "I'll go. Mayor, can you rally a few volunteers to keep this place secure? Dr. Rivera, you come with me. We'll see if the old boiler can be fired up." Mayor Caldwell clapped him on the shoulder, forcing a weak grin. "Be careful, Jonas, and bring back good news." They set out under the cover of swirling snow, navigating streets turned into a labyrinth of razor-sharp red frost. Jonas, Dr. Rivera, and two other townspeople, Derek and Beth, carried flashlights and wore multiple layers of clothing. Each exhalation seemed to freeze mid-air. The frost crunched beneath their boots, almost screaming for warmth. "Straight ahead," Derek called, pointing through a swirl of white and crimson drifts. The outline of the old factory loomed like a slumbering beast against the storm-dark sky. Jonas's heart thumped as they pushed open the rusted double doors and entered the cavernous interior. Rusted machinery, collapsed catwalks, and ancient boilers greeted them with ghostly silence. Their flashlight beams revealed swirling motes of dust, swirling as if alive in the frosty air. "Down there," Beth said, gesturing to a huge metal tank surrounded by twisted pipes, likely the old boiler. Dr. Rivera dashed forward, her breath ragged with cold. She knelt by the control panel, wiping away decades of grime and tapping the gauges. "Let's see if we still have any power," she murmured, prying open a control box. With a spark of luck, or possibly fate, there was a flicker from a half-dead battery circuit. If we can transfer enough energy to spark the ignition and feed the boiler, we might get a single burst of intense heat. That might be all we need. They poured what little diesel they had left into the main line, hooking up a portable generator. The place smelled of rancid fuel and rust. A hush fell as Dr. Rivera tested the ignition switch. Click. Nothing. Click. Another pause. Then vroom! The ancient boiler rumbled awake like a dragon stirring from centuries of slumber. Jonas, Derek, and Beth let out near-simultaneous cries of relief, though they knew it was far from over. If this worked, the boiler would become a beacon for the frost, an offering of pure heat. The temperature in the factory began to rise, steam whistling from the worn pipes. Jonas could feel the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. They didn't have to wait long. A thunderous crash came from the front doors. The red frost surged inward, a swirling cloud of shimmering crystals that advanced with unnerving intent. Derek cried out, stumbling backward as the frost inched toward him, twisting into spectral shapes. "They're alive," he whispered, voice trembling. "No time!" Dr. Rivera yelled. "Jonas, open every release valve on the boiler. We need full heat output now." Jonas rushed around the massive metal tank, twisting valves as steam blasted forth in scalding jets. The temperature shot up drastically, turning the interior of the factory into a sweltering chamber. Sweat beaded on Jonas's forehead, which felt surreal in the middle of a lethal winter. The frost hissed and recoiled at first, then advanced anew, drawn by the staggering amount of heat. Tendrils of living ice slithered across the concrete floor, forming gnarled limbs that reached for the boiler. Each time the frost gained ground, Jonas and the others retreated further back, letting it converge on the industrial behemoth at the heart of the room. Just then, Dr. Rivera pulled out a small container of chemicals, her last-ditch plan. "I tested a reaction," she shouted to Jonas. "If we superheat this mixture and combine it with the steam, it should cause a thermal cascade." "Do it!" Jonas yelled. Dr. Rivera flung the container into the heart of the boiler's flame. The reaction was immediate and explosive, a deafening roar as metal groaned. Heat radiated out in a shockwave. 1,000 stinging sparks soared through the air like molten fireflies. Jonas, Dr. Rivera, Derek, and Beth dove for cover behind a metal pillar. A scream, like ice scraping glass, tore through the factory as the frost shapes convulsed. The intense heat of the overloaded boiler assaulted them, their crystalline limbs fracturing. Crimson shards rained down, melting into puddles of water that steamed on the scorched floor. Jonas winced, covering Olivia's photograph in his pocket to shield it from flying debris. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The roar of the boiler ebbed into a fading rumble. Where the frost had been, only dripping water remained, stained faintly pink like diluted blood. Derek slumped to his knees, stunned. Beth let out a shaky laugh of disbelief. Dr. Rivera smiled through tears, her voice unsteady. "It worked! Oh, thank God it worked!" Jonas forced himself to his feet, scanning the factory. No sign of the lethal frost remained, only scorched walls and the pungent smell of burnt metal. "We have to get back to town hall," he said. "Make sure everyone else is all right." They emerged from the factory into an eerily still night. Snow was still falling, but the menacing red crystals had vanished, leaving only normal white snow underfoot. Relief battled exhaustion in Jonas's heart. If the frost was truly gone, maybe Silvervale had a chance to celebrate Christmas after all. When they returned to town hall, the townspeople greeted them with hesitant hope. Mayor Caldwell let out a tearful shout at the sight of the safe party. Jonas scooped Olivia into his arms, tears in his eyes. She sobbed softly, clinging to him. Dr. Rivera announced that the threat appeared to be destroyed. Cheers mingled with disbelieving laughter. Outside, dawn began to lighten the sky, a new day. Though the memory of the red frost would scar Silvervale for generations, there was a palpable sense of rebirth in the crisp morning air. Jonas looked into Olivia's eyes, remembering Emily and everything they'd been through. He clutched the photograph in his coat pocket, heart pounding with gratitude. "We made it," he whispered, pressing his forehead to his daughter's. A warmth bloomed in his chest, not just relief, but the promise of a future no longer overshadowed by a creeping terror. That Christmas morning, against all odds, Silvervale stood united. And while the townspeople would never forget the nightmare of the red frost, they reveled in the simplest of gifts, the return of ordinary, untainted snow. For Jonas and Olivia, it was a miracle that reaffirmed hope survives even the darkest, coldest nights, so long as people stand together, hearts ablaze with unwavering love.